As comedians so helpfully and often do, Kurt Vonnegut pointed out the hypocrisy of modern Christianity in so often demanding a public display of the Ten Commandments with all of its harsh regulations and enumerations of sins, while they almost never even mention the Beatitudes, which Matthew attributes to Jesus with all of its more helpful, inclusive, and comforting assurances. Though his son actually did earn a degree in religion and at least flirted with the idea of being a Christian minister, Kurt Vonnegut probably had no idea what a powerful juxtaposition it was to put the Ten Commandments to be read alongside of the Beatitudes. I don't want to bore you with a lot of seminary talk about the finer points of biblical scholarship, but allow me to just say briefly that the author of the Gospel of Matthew organizes his material in a way to present Jesus as a kind of new Moses. The Gospel is even set around 5 major speeches, the way that the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy is organized around 5 speeches from Moses. And there is little doubt that Matthew offered us these Beatitudes as a new version of the Ten Commandments. Not something Kurt Vonnegut would have known, but he probably also wouldn't have cared if he had known. If you will allow me a brief jaunt into history, we don't know if there actually was a historical Moses. In fact, if I had to bet, I would bet against it. We don't have anything written down about Moses prior to the Babylonian exile in the 5th century BCE. And frankly, I find it to be just a tad too convenient for the Judeans living in captivity as slaves in Babylon to have a historical founder of their religion and their nation who just happened to have liberated their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. Parts of the story certainly reflect a more ancient history, but all in all, I think we have to take the entire Moses narrative with a grain of salt. We are not, after all, in possession of the tablets of stone that we saw Charlton Heston holding in the old Cecil B. DeMille's movie, but we do have this 7-foot-tall Babylonian stela from about the same time period as if Moses had lived, he would have lived at about the time that this Code of Hammurabi would have been chiseled into stone and set up. The 2 figures that you see at the top of this stela show King Hammurabi receiving these laws from the seated and much larger figure of Shamash, the Babylonian god of the sun. So you see how the Hebrews reinterpreted the ancient belief that the laws were given by God to a current ruler, which is intended to give those laws much greater importance and to make it rather more frightening to not follow them. You see, there is a kind of religion that is called civil religion, a religion that is used by the state in order to help it govern the people. If you live on an island by yourself, there are no laws, right? Whatever you do when you live alone is beyond much ethical deliberation, kind of like it is at my house these days. When there are just a few people in a tribe, conduct is governed by the consensus of the tribe. But when a society starts to become more populous, then, as they say, every work site needs a manager and a water boy. Someone has to be in charge, and there have to be rules in order to maintain a stable society. The Code of Hammurabi is more complex than the Ten Commandments, but they do have a lot of similarities. They both prohibit murder, stealing, lying, taking your neighbor's spouse, and they both demand a certain exclusive loyalty. All that stuff in the Ten Commandments about honoring Yahweh was not so much about God being inherently jealous or possessive as it was about keeping the tribe of Hebrews separate and apart from all of the competing tribes in the region. The exclusive monotheism of the Jews, along with their dietary code, their rules regarding family, property, and even how they dressed, helped to keep them from just getting lost in the biological and cultural soup of the ancient Near East. And you got to admit, it worked pretty well. It's not too hard to find a community of Jews in our society today, but try to look up a community of Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Havites, or Jebusites. They are darn near invisible these days. So the Ten Commandments were more about maintaining a stable society in a region where you lived near competing cultures, religions, languages, and where resources were scarce. It was more about a stable society than it was about establishing a religion. Religious anxiety added to it just helped to enforce the laws even if the police weren't around. The laws didn't create the religion fostered the laws. So as in the United States, we often see religious symbols in government buildings, just as we see American flags, literally our battle flag, displayed in church sanctuaries. The church and the state are often like two hands washing one another. And it isn't hard to see how the laws served those who had something to steal or something to fear from the masses of the poor who might just decide to kill them and take their land, their food, and, put their feet on the furniture. Rich people can't have nice things if they're always afraid of the poor people who terribly outnumber them. It's no great wonder, then, that it's usually the conservative white supremacists who live in majority black parts of the country who keep wanting to put up the Ten Commandments on the courthouse lawn. But I digress. Civil religion, after all, isn't all bad. I don't want to live in a place where murder and theft are not strongly discouraged. I don't want to live behind security fences or be heavily armed to protect myself in my home or in public. I'm sure Kurt Vonnegut would have felt the same way. Still, as useful and sometimes helpful as civil religion can be, it's not the same kind of spirituality that we hope to see out of a loving, forgiving, and kind Jesus. Again, not to wade too deeply into the weeds of biblical scholarship, but I very much prefer the version of the Beatitudes that we find in Luke over what's in Matthew. Matthew's are better known because they sound more like the stained glass Jesus, where Luke says, "Blessed are the hungry, for they shall be filled." Matthew changes that to, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Honestly, have you ever met anybody that hungered and thirsted for righteousness? And if you did, would you ever want to hang out with them? Would you go to a movie or go out to get a beer with someone who could honestly tell you, "You know what I'm really jonesing for right now? A little more righteousness." Check, please. Christians don't bring up the Beatitudes very often for much of the same reason that all of those "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets disappeared from convenience store counters the day after 9/11. There are times that we don't want to ask ourselves what Jesus would do because we know good and well that we're about to do the opposite. For nearly 20 years, we've been bombing people who had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11 just because we got scared. Still, they never managed to develop a market for "Who Would Jesus Bomb" bracelets because, well, I guess we already know the answer to that, don't we? The late evangelical preacher, Tony Campolo, at least tried to challenge the hypocrisy and narcissism of evangelicals when he pointed out that even though the whole thing about being born again only appears once in the Gospels, in Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus in the Gospel of John, and yet evangelicals all seem to be eager to identify themselves as one of those, that they're a born-again Christian. And yet the injunction to sell all you own and give it to the poor, that's in the Gospels twice. That's in Matthew and Luke. And I have never yet met I sold all I owned and gave it to the poor Christian. Of course, while we have a little more reason to believe that there was a historical Jesus, honest scholarship would acknowledge that we really don't know much about him. And certainly he did not originate very much of what is attributed to him in the New Testament. However, the most reliable of biblical scholars who have examined which parts of the gospel sayings might have actually come from Jesus are things that most Christians would really very much prefer that Jesus had never said, or if he said them, he didn't mean them the way they sound. The single most universally affirmed verse of the New Testament that scholars agree is a legit Jesus saying is this: love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. When was the last time you heard a sermon on that? Or that business about it being easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God? Or how about forgive the one who has offended you, not 7 times, but 7 times 70? Or don't return a blow to the one who strikes you, but instead offer them the other cheek? And if someone asks for your coat, give them your coat and your shirt and your shoes at the same time. If someone actually showed up in most churches saying things like that, you wouldn't find them in the pulpit. It would be more likely that you would find them out in the parking lot, bound and gagged and thrown behind the dumpsters. And just as a thought experiment, what would happen if someone said those things on Fox News? We're not here to talk about Fox News, but just a thought. I don't know if traditional bricks and mortar churches have much of a future. As a corollary to what I said earlier about Moses, if I were betting on the church being around in another generation or not, I'm afraid that I would have to bet against it. I hope that I'm wrong. Even as keepers of the traditions of civil religion, they have performed some useful purposes, if nothing more than providing a usually free space for AA and Al-Anon meetings, even as disappointing as their Sunday morning gatherings usually are. But sincere spirituality is not simply a hell-avoiding ticket to heaven, neither of which actually exist, but rather a journey towards being a better person, a more generous, forgiving, loving, and justice-seeking person. I have not personally identified as a Christian for several years now. After all those years of seeing both bishops and pastors writing responses to my newspaper articles telling me that I'm not a real Christian, I finally realized that they're probably right. If they are Christians, then I'm certainly not one of them. But there are some very challenging teachings that are at least attributed to Jesus, whether they originated with him or not, that we could all learn from. And that's probably all that Jesus would have wanted from us anyway. He didn't ask anyone to wear his name, after all. He really just asked us to be better people. And I'm all for that, and I hope you are too. Blessed are the peacemakers.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.